If your company hires a new independent auditor or your current auditor resigns, is fired, or indicates it won't stand for reappointment, you need to file a Form 8K with the SEC within 4 business days. Today on Zippy Point. I'm Brock Romanek, and I'm a big fan of yous. So if your independent auditor is gone, going to be gone, or you have a new one, that's a big deal. So as noted in the instruction to item 4.01 to Form 8K, you're likely going to have at least 2 8Ks here, one when the current auditor leaves, and then one for when a new auditor is hired, although these sometimes are combined in the same 8K. If you have the same time frame, they can work. And perhaps a third 8K sometimes to announce the completion of the services of the soon-to-depart auditor once their audit is completed. So here's an example of an 8K where a company hired a new auditor at the same time that the old one was dismissed. Then here's an example of an 8K where a company announced a new auditor after engaging in a competitive search process and then hired a new auditor. This example uses separate captions to highlight the dismissal and the hiring. I like that kind of thing. So if you change your auditor, you're probably going to be filing 2 or 3 8Ks, and then you will also be providing disclosure in your next proxy statement and perhaps a proxy after that. And I have a separate Vid-Guide to cover this type of proxy disclosure, link to which is below. Item 4.01 itself references item 304A1 and A3 of Regulation SK. Those are regulations that you're going to have to become comfortable with if you have a change in auditor. That's the regulation that will guide you for your proxy disclosure too regarding the auditor change. Section 4510 of the CorpFin Financial Reporting Manual also contains some guidance in this area, so you're going to want to check that out. So what to disclose? There are 6 required items to disclose. 1, whether the auditor resigned, declined to stand for re-election, or was discharged. One of these must be specifically stated in the filing. 2, the date of resignation or discharge. 3, whether the decision was recommended or approved by your board of directors or a board committee. 4, whether the auditor had issued a report in the last 2 fiscal years containing a disclaimer or an adverse opinion, or that was qualified or modified in some way. A modified opinion includes an opinion that expresses substantial doubt about whether a company has a going concern. 5, whether in connection with the audits of the 2 most recent years through the date of resignation or discharge, there were any disagreements with the former auditor on any matter, whether, if not resolved to the satisfaction of the auditor, would have caused the account to make reference to it in its audit report. Among other items specified in item 304A14, the filing should describe the subject matter of the disagreement. So disagreements are big here. Disagreements required to be reported includes those that are both resolved to the satisfaction of the auditor and that are not resolved. So even resolved disagreements trigger a disclosure here. The disclosures about disagreements required by item 304B must always be provided where required, even if they have been previously disclosed. So you can't just cross-reference them. You just can't assume that investors know them. This is instruction 1 to item 304. And then 6, if there are any reportable events described under 304A15 during the most 2 recent years and any interim period preceding the former auditor's resignation or discharge, providing the disclosures required by 304A14. You're going to have to know these sections. I hate just spitting out numbers. Also, here's instruction 1 to regulation, item 304 of Regulation SK. It talks about disclosures regarding disagreements between the auditor and the company must always be provided, even if previous disclosure about that disagreement has already been provided. So here's an example where a company disclosed in an 8K that there was a disagreement with its old auditor over material weaknesses in its internal controls. And here's another one with a beef over material weaknesses. You can see this is a common pattern where there's a disagreement between management and its current auditor over internal controls, and soon that auditor is their former auditor. Under this CorpFin staff interpretation, all item 401 events must be reported on a Form 8K. They can't be pushed off to a Form 10Q or a 10K, even if those periodic reports are filed within the Form 8K deadline. And there's a bunch of SEC staff compliance and disclosure interpretations in this item 401 8K area. I'll let you look up those on your own. There's a little bit over a dozen, I believe. I should also mention if you have a reverse merger on your hand, as you can see in the CorpFin Financial Reporting Manual, Section 4520.3, that there's almost a reverse acquisition almost always results in a change in accounts, and you'll have an item 4.01 8K to be filed. Let's talk trigger dates. You might have a number of them because you might have a number of 8Ks being filed. So first, there might be a trigger when an auditor notifies the company that it's resigning. The trigger date is the date it does notify the company that it's resigning, not the date that the auditor's resignation is effective. They're typically two different things. Let's talk other trigger dates. The audit committee decides to fire the auditor or decides not to re-up the auditor when its term expires. That's a trigger date. The audit committee decides to hire a new auditor. That then has to get full board approval, and then the new auditor has to go through its client approval process before you have a trigger date for that instance. Exhibits. So under item 304A3 of Regulation SK, the company must provide the former auditor with a copy of its 8K disclosure no later than the date it files its 8K. The company then asks the auditor to provide a letter to the SEC stating whether the auditor agrees with the 8K disclosure. So then that can be filed no later than 10 business days after the filing of the report in an amendment to the 8K. The 8K should include any written notice received from the auditor as Exhibit 16 under item 9.01 of Form 8K. Under all these 8Ks, exhibits are filed under item 9.01. Then you look at item 601 of Regulation SK to see what numbering the exhibit is for an item 4.01 8K. In this case, it's item 16 will be the number. So here you have an example with an amended 8K to include the departing auditor's letter to the SEC as an exhibit, and you'll see that's filed under, numbered as Exhibit 16. And here you have an example with an amended 8K to include the departing auditor's letter to the SEC as an exhibit, and it repeats the entire original 8K in the body of the amended 8K. There's no need to do that, but that's nice because you're not forcing investors to go and look at two separate documents. If a company amends its item 401 8K disclosure for any reason, it must also file an updated letter from the auditor addressing the revised disclosures as an Exhibit 16. So it has to give the former auditor another bite at the apple to approve this revised disclosure, approve or disagree, and explain why it disagrees. And then under this Corp Fin staff interpretation, if the predecessor, the former auditor, refuses to furnish an Exhibit 16 letter stating whether it agrees with the company's disclosure, the company should file an amendment to its 8K stating that that former auditor won't cough up one of these letters. And then you might have an exhibit from your new auditor if you're filing an 8K for your new auditor. Under item 304A2 ID of Regulation SK, the company must ask the new auditor to review its 401 disclosure on, in an 8K and provide the auditor the opportunity to send the company a letter addressed to the SEC containing any new information, clarification of the company's expression of its views, or the extent to which it doesn't agree with the statements made. If the company happens to receive such a letter, it must file it with as an amendment to the 8K. I haven't seen these, but I haven't looked hard.